Our little lives are kept in equipoise by opposite attractions and desires, the struggle of the instinct that enjoys, and the more noble instinct that aspires. These perturbations, this perpetual jar of earthly wants and aspirations high, come from the influence of an unseen star, an undiscovered planet in our sky. And just as the moon from some dark gate of cloud throws over the sea a floating bridge of light, across whose trembling planks our fancies crowd into the realm of mystery and night, so too from the spirit world there descends a bridge of light connecting it with this, over whose unsteady floor, which sways and bends, wander our thoughts above the dark abyss. So writes Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in his poem Haunted Houses. It's a curious poem. The first half is about ghosts and ghoulies and undead beasties, the kind that haunt your house. And then the second half of the poem concerns this idea that your soul is divided into a pair of struggling parts, and that one of these parts gains strength from a supernatural entity, an entity that sheds something spiritual in the way that the moon sheds light. Huh. What accounts for the unity of that poem? Well, in a word, Platonism. Hey everyone, Dr. Bauer's Office Hours, and today we're going to be discussing Platonic Psychology as it appears in Republic Book 4, specifically around 436-ish to 445-ish. I say ish because there's an appearance around 431 where we get a mention of this jar between earthly wants and aspirations high that Longfellow talks about, but it doesn't really get serious and argumentative until around 436. The idea that each of us contains struggling elements, the idea of interpsychic conflict, is more than just a meme involving two wolves. It's also a very old idea about human nature, and it's one that we ordinarily appeal to all the time in the way that we talk, especially when we discuss our motivations. We often say things like, well, part of me wants to do this, but part of me wants to do that, and there are more dramatic cases in which someone's inner nature in media is often represented as characters, like their conscience and their appetites as a devil and angel on their shoulders. The question of whether the soul has parts, moreover, bleeds into important issues in theology. Many Christian proofs of the immortality of the soul proceed by way of first observing or claiming that the soul doesn't have any parts. And that if the soul doesn't have any parts, then there's no way for the soul to disintegrate. There is no way for it to come apart. There is no way for it to corrode or rot away. And that since there's no way for it to corrode or rot away or disintegrate, the soul must then be immortal. Right? That's an old proof for the immortality of the soul, and it rests on the idea that the soul is simple. In the heroic and epic narratives which so frequently populate our cinemas and our novels and our other media, you often find characters who, in the course of their journey, must confront a bad part of themselves. Sometimes the confrontation is literal, as though they fight like a shadowy version of themselves or something. But other times, it's more symbolic, and they have to come to terms with some part of their mind or some part of their history. Right? So the idea of interpsychic conflict, the idea that we have parts that struggle with each other, that is a very old and influential idea, and we're going to talk about that. As for the stuff concerning a supernatural entity that sheds something spiritual in the way that an astral body sheds light, that more pertains to the sun and line analogies, as well as the allegory of the cave. The idea that you are divided into struggling elements, struggling parts with differing motivations, is central to Plato's philosophy. However, he doesn't take it for granted. He argues for it at length and in detail, specifically in the part of Republic Book 4 that we're looking at. We should note first at 431a, Socrates asks, isn't the term self-mastery ridiculous, though? For of course, the one who is master of himself is also the one who is weaker. And the one who is weaker is also the one who masters. After all, the same person is referred to in all these descriptions. Like, take the idea of self-control, right? Someone says, control yourself, and so you do, right? In that case, isn't the person who's doing the controlling you? And isn't the person who's being controlled also you? So that would have to mean that you are stronger than yourself since you are controlling yourself? How does that make sense? That sounds like a contradiction. That's the puzzle that Socrates is pointing out here. Socrates goes on, it seems to me, however, that what this term is trying to indicate is that within the same person's soul there is a better thing and a worse thing. Whenever the naturally better one masters the worse, this is called being a master of oneself. In other words, within a soul, there's a couple of different elements, one better and one worse, and that when the better one wins out in their struggle, that's what self-control is. That's Socrates' hypothesis. He hasn't argued for it yet. Let's turn to that argument now. At 436, Socrates asks a question about desires, or a question about wants. And when he's asking about our desires, he's specifically asking about our desires for knowledge, our desires for honor and popularity, and our desires for more base, appetitive things. He asks, do we do each of them with the same thing? Or, since they are three, do we do one with one and another with another? What? That is to say, do we learn with one, feel anger with another, and with yet a third have an appetite for the pleasures of food, sex, and those closely akin to them? Or do we do each of them with the whole of our soul once we feel the impulse? That is what is difficult to determine in a way that is up to the standards of our argument. So Socrates is asking, is our soul divided into parts which seek different things? Or is the soul single and undivided, seeking whatever it seeks at all times with the entirety of itself? It's a really abstract question, but he's basically asking, is the soul divided into parts? Socrates begins his argument by claiming, first, it is clear that the same thing cannot do or undergo opposite things, not at any rate in the same respect, in relation to the same thing, at the same time. So, if we ever find that happening here, we will know that we are not dealing with one and the same thing, but with many. What is he saying? Well, he's saying that here is a test to see whether something has parts. The test is this. Does it have opposite features at the very same time? If it does, then it's got to have parts, right? Let's consider his examples. Is it possible for the same thing at the same time and in the same way to be standing still and moving? Glaucon says no, but then Socrates asks, you see, if anyone said of a person who is standing still but still moving his hands and head, that the same thing is moving and standing still at the same time, we would not consider, I imagine, that he should say that, but rather that in one respect the person is standing still, while in another he is moving. So the idea is this. Moving and standing still are opposites. So, if anything has both those features at the same time, it must have parts, right? No single thing can move and stand still. What about the guy who's standing still and moving his arms? Oh, well, he's not accomplishing some impossible feat. He's not defying the law of non-contradiction. He has one part which is standing still, and another part which is moving. Let's take another example. Being red and being green are opposites. Nothing can be both red and green. But suppose I told you I got a sweater that was both red and green. I got a red and green sweater. Does that sound like an impossible object? Does that sound like a round square? No. Because red and green are opposites, when I tell you that I've got a sweater which is both, you just automatically assume that part of the sweater is red and a different part is green. You can tell that the sweater has parts because it has opposite features, red and green, at the same time. Suppose I tell you that I have a toy which is both fuzzy and smooth, right? Fuzzy and smooth are opposites. So does that mean the toy is some impossible object? No. It just means that one part of the toy must be fuzzy and a different part of the toy must be smooth. Or suppose I told you that a fire poker was both hot and cold. Oh my goodness, how could that be? Hot and cold are opposites. How could something be both hot and cold? Maybe that person is lying about the impossible fire poker. No. The fire poker can be both hot and cold by having one part that's hot and a different part that's cold. Another example of Socrates concerns a top which is spinning. Right? Although the top is spinning around and every physical part of it is moving, the physical wood is moving and spinning, we might say that as it stands upright during the spin, its axis does not move. The axis remains there. Right? So the axis of the top does not move, even though other parts of the top do. Right? That's how the top could accomplish the feat of having opposite features, the feature of spinning and the feature of not moving at all. Right? The idea is that having parts allows something to have opposite properties. Furthermore, it's the only thing that allows something to have opposite properties at the same time. If it ever seems like something has opposite properties at the same time, then that thing must have parts, one part of which has one of the opposites, and another part of which has the other opposite. That's a principle that Socrates is committing to, and it's a premise in his argument. We'll call it the principle of opposites, and it goes like this. If a thing X has opposite features, F and G, then X has at least two parts, one of which is F, and a different one of which is G. So far, so good. We've got a test for when something has parts. Maybe we can use this test on the soul to see whether it has parts. Socrates' next premise goes like this. Wouldn't you consider assent and dissent, wanting to have something and rejecting it, taking something and pushing it away, as all being pairs of mutual opposites, whether of opposite doings or of opposite undergoings does not matter? In other words, here's a pair of opposites, wanting something on one hand, and being averse to it, or rejecting it, or pushing it away, right? We're going to focus on that pair of opposites. They aren't exactly features, they're more like relations, so we'll have to make sure that when we consider them to be opposites, we're imagining someone to want a thing, and then also be averse to or reject that very thing. So let's put the second premise this way, that wanting something and being averse to that same thing are opposite features. Socrates points out that hunger and thirst are wishing and willing of a certain kind, and that to the extent that you hunger or thirst, you seek a thing or you want a thing. Socrates defines thirst as a desire for drink, just drink, and he distinguishes it from different kinds of thirst that one might have. Thus he writes, a thirst for hot drink or cold, or a thirst for much drink, or for little, or for drink of a certain sort. Isn't it rather that if heat is present in addition to the thirst, it causes the appetite to be for something cold, whereas the addition of something cold makes it an appetite for something hot? So the idea is that if we're thinking of a specific type of thirst, that's going to be for a specific type of drink. So if I'm really thirsty on a hot day, that will make me want a cold drink. Having a hot, parched thirst makes me want a cold type of drink, right? And then maybe being thirsty on a very cold day makes me want a hot drink. A very, very cold thirst makes me want a hot drink, right? But if we're just considering thirst by itself, thirst on its own, so to speak, thirst kathauto, as Plato would say, that's just a desire for drink and nothing else. Furthermore, and this is important for Plato, Socrates distinguishes the desire which is thirst on one hand from the judgment that it is good to drink on the other, right? It's one thing to have the sort of desire to drink, which is called thirst. It's one thing to have that desire for drink. But it's a different thing altogether to think that drinking is good, right? It's really important for Plato, and so for the character of Socrates, to distinguish those two right here. That's why he writes, no one should catch us unprepared or disturb us by claiming that no one has an appetite for drink, but rather for good drink, nor for food, but rather for good food, since everyone's appetite is for good things. What Socrates is doing here is he's distinguishing an appetitive desire, that feeling that type of a want, from having a judgment, right? Those are different sorts of things. Having a want or having a desire is a different sort of thing than judging a certain way, right? Just because you want drink does not mean that you think it is good to drink. And that's actually what the argument focuses on. Let's get back to that. Having defined thirst in this way, Socrates says, the soul of a thirsty person, insofar as it is simply thirsty, does not want anything else except to drink. And this is what it longs for and is impelled to do. So, in the argument, we'll say, thirst is the desire for drink. Not any type of drink, just drink. Next, Socrates observes that some people are thirsty, but are unwilling to drink, right? In other words, there are people who they're very thirsty, and yet, even though they are thirsty, they are unwilling to drink at all. They are averse to drinking. What kind of a situation might that be? Here's a good example, and I think it's the kind of example Plato had in mind. You are going to have surgery tomorrow. Because you are going to have surgery tomorrow, the doctors have instructed you not to eat or drink anything, even water. So you know it is not good to drink. On these grounds, you are averse to drinking. You judge it is not good to drink. You are averse. You reject drinking. Does this mean that your thirst goes away? Does this mean that now you cannot be thirsty? No. During the time in which you are unwilling to drink, you become thirsty. You become thirsty despite the fact that you are unwilling to drink. That kind of a situation. And the fact that you think it's bad to drink, the fact that you do not think it's good to drink, that doesn't make your thirst go away. No one should catch us unprepared by saying that thirst is only for good drink, in other words. But now look, we've got the very same thing undergoing opposite features. For if a soul is thirsty and unwilling to drink, it follows that the soul wants and does not want to drink. It desires drink, but is also averse to it. And it follows from our first premise, then, that the soul must have two parts, at least two, one of which wants to drink and one of which does not. That's the idea. So, Socrates thinks this is grounds for saying that the soul has two elements within it, right? Is when we focus on those cases where a person is thirsty, where they have a powerful thirst, and yet they are completely unwilling to drink. That pair of opposite things, right? The desire for drink And the aversion to it, that shows there must be two parts within the individual, two parts of the soul. On those grounds, Socrates thinks he's distinguished those parts. Let's move on. It would not be unreasonable for us to claim, then, that there are two elements different from one another, and to call the element in the soul with which it calculates the rationally calculating element, and the one with which it feels passion, hungers, thirsts, and is stirred by other appetites, the irrational and appetitive element, friend to certain ways of being filled and certain pleasures. So here's the idea. If we focus on those cases in which a thirsty person is unwilling to drink, right, like the case involving surgery, we could say that the part of you that is thirsty is sort of a animalistic, an appetitive part, because it's just an appetite. It doesn't involve thinking about anything or considering any calculation. Your desire for thirst is just brute in that sense, right? It's an appetitive element. So there's an appetitive part of you that wants drink. But the part of you that's averse to drinking, right, is the part that also incorporates the surgery into the calculation. It calculates for the future. It considers for other things. It seeks, well, the overall calculated good, right? That's the other element. So in a case like this, Plato thinks, there's your appetitive element, right? That's the part of you that desires drink or food or sex. And according to Plato, later we'll see, it can be trained to like money too, right? But there's an appetitive element that wants drink, and then there's a rational element that wants the overall calculated good. Right? So we've got two parts of the soul. We've got the appetitive part of the soul, and we've got the rational part of the soul. And these parts of the soul, remember, parts of the soul are sets of desires, or they're drives. That's the best way to think of them, is they're drives. They seek certain things for satisfaction. They want certain things. They push the individual in certain ways, and their collective pushing, the vector sum of their collective pushing, is the actions of that individual, right? So that's Plato's argument for the division of the soul into two parts, the rational part and the appetitive part. Let's move on from there. But before we do, let me give you a quick quiz. Let's make sure that we understand the spirit of Plato's argument, right? Here's a question. How does Plato argue that the soul has parts? Is it A, in order to want different things at the same time, the soul must have parts? Is it B, in order to want something while being averse to it at the same time, the soul must have parts? Is it C, in order to be thirsty, the soul must have parts? Or is it D, purple hedgehog? Here's a minute to think. That's right, it's B. Remember, Plato doesn't think that the soul has to have parts simply because we want a lot of different things, as though there has to be a different part for everything we want. That's not the inference. Plato is positing parts of the soul in order to solve a puzzle, right? The puzzle is, how can it be that on certain occasions a person is thirsty yet unwilling to drink? The answer is, they have different parts, one of which thirsts, the other of which is unwilling, right? That's why Plato thinks the soul has parts. Moving along, Socrates says, let's assume that we have distinguished these two kinds of elements in the soul. Now, is the spirited element, the one with which we feel anger, a third kind of thing? Or is it the same in nature as one of these others? This may strike us as odd. Plato has just said, on one hand, there is an appetitive part of the soul, which wants food and intoxication and sex and the money that can be used to get them, just sort of basic physical animal pleasures. And then there's another part of us that seeks the overall calculated good, taking everything into account. Why are we now bringing up the part that feels anger? What does that have to do with our psychology? How is that a third thing? In order to explain that, we're going to appeal to a certain idea of Aristotle's. So here is a brief but informative digression. Anger, like many emotions, is a kind of detection mechanism. That's the way that Plato and Aristotle are thinking about emotions, as like detection mechanisms. As a simple example, let's consider the emotion of fear. Fear, according to Plato and Aristotle, is your danger sense, your danger detector. You know how Spider-Man has a danger sense? For Spider-Man, whenever he detects danger, there's a little tingle that goes off, right? The tingle is his detecting there's danger nearby. Well, we've got that too. It's just that instead of feeling a tingle in the back of our skull, we feel afraid. That affective episode of feeling afraid, that's our danger sense going off, right? To feel afraid is to detect danger. Now, of course, and you may be thinking this right now, our danger detectors don't work very well then, because there are lots of people you know whose danger detectors are going off all the time, even when there isn't danger there. They're afraid even when there's no danger. And then there's other people where they aren't afraid even when there is danger there, right? Those are two ways, according to Aristotle, to be out of the mean with respect to fear, right? To be virtuous with respect to fear is to be afraid of all and only the dangerous things exactly to the degree that they're dangerous, is to have a perfectly reliable danger detector. That's what emotional virtue is for fear, right? Moving to anger, right? Anger is your insult detector, right? To feel angry is to feel that you've been insulted, right? So the idea is that you look out in the world and you survey everything, and if you get angry, it's because you're detecting an insult there. There's something there where you're perceiving it as being an insult to you. It's treating you with less than the honor you deserve. It's treating you with less than the social worth that you deserve. For that's what an insult is. At least according to the ancient Greeks, to insult someone is to treat them with less honor than they deserve. And for someone to feel insulted is for them to feel as though they are being treated with less esteem than they deserve, less respect than they deserve, right? And that goes along with our contemporary notion of anger to some degree. When someone gets angry, even if it's just at the weather, right? They think, I don't deserve this. Grr, this shouldn't, it's not fair, it shouldn't happen, I don't deserve it. I deserve better, right? That thought frequently accompanies episodes of anger, right? The feeling of anger, again, for the ancient Greeks, is your detection of an insult, right? It's your detection that you're being treated with less social esteem than you deserve, right? Now that is the key that unlocks this notion of the spirited part of the soul, okay? The spirited part of the soul is the part of us that feels anger, right? And we feel angry when we don't get the social esteem that we want, right? The spirited part of the soul is the part of the soul that seeks social esteem. It seeks popularity. It seeks honor. It's the part of you that wants to be liked. We might call it the social part of the soul, because it's concerned with social esteem and social praise and being liked by people, right? It's the part of you that's not concerned with just your basic animal appetites, and it's not concerned with what's good overall. It's concerned with, oh, what'll people think of me? It's concerned with what might be embarrassing or shameful, right? That's the spirited part of the soul, right? The part of you that feels anger is the part of you that wants social esteem. That's why later in the Republic, Plato refers to it as the honor-loving part of the soul, right? That's how it could be that the honor-loving part of the soul is also the part with which we feel anger. How can that go together? Well, it's because of this idea that anger is the frustration of our desire for social esteem. In the same way that hunger pains might be the frustration of our desire for food, right? Our appetitive desire for food, when frustrated, leads to hunger pains. And our spirited desire for social esteem, our spirited desire to be praised, when frustrated, leads to anger, right? Interesting question when thinking about anger in this way. Can't animals get angry? Couldn't like a bear or a dog get angry? And Plato and Aristotle both thought, yeah, they can. They totally can. So wait, does that mean that animals can feel insulted? Yeah, absolutely. What do you think it is to be territorial? An animal that's territorial. An animal that's territorial, it lays claim to a certain region, and by doing so, it's making it illegitimate for you to trespass there, right? How dare you? It's my territory. I am insulted, right? That's the message in the bark of the dog or the growl of the bear, right? I mean, not literally, but that's the way that Plato and Aristotle are thinking, is that animals can get insulted too. They're territorial. That by infringing on their territory, that's an insult to them, right? Anger is tied with insult. To feel angry is to perceive you're insulted, right? So, going back to the argument, Socrates is asking, hey, our desire for social esteem, right? Is that some third separate thing that's different from our animal desires and from our desire for the overall good? Or is it more like our desire for social esteem is just the same as one of those? Is it that among our animal desires, we also have a desire for social esteem, and that's just part of our animal desires? Or is it that among our desires for the overall calculated good, that includes our social desires, and our social desires are part of our desire for the overall good, right? Is it one of those, or is it that the desire for social esteem is a third separate part of the soul? Are there two parts of the soul or three, right? That's what we're focused on right now. They take a pair of cases in order to argue that the soul has three parts. Here's the first. Socrates says, "But once I heard a story, and I believe it. Leontius, the son of Aglion, was going up from the Piraeus along the outside of the north wall when he saw some corpses with the public executioner nearby." So there's a guy, he's walking along outside, and he sees a ditch that's full of corpses. Naked corpses. Ditch full of naked dead people. He had an appetitive desire to look at them. An appetitive desire. So, what are the appetites? Let's see. The desire for food, the desire for drink, and by that Plato means intoxication, right? The desire for food, intoxication, and sex, and then also money. Now, which of those appetites might be curried by a bunch of naked dead bodies? Do you think Leontius wants to eat the naked dead bodies? He's hungry for them? Do you think that Leontius wants to get tore up on the naked dead bodies? That he can somehow get intoxicated by them? Or do you think it's that Leontius has a sexual interest in the naked dead bodies? Probably that one. And sure enough, a fragment of the comedy Capelides by Theopompus tells us that a certain Leontinus was known for his love of boys as pale as corpses. So there's a joke that we've got in a comedy about a guy named Leontinus who really likes looking at naked corpses, right? And here we're talking about a story about a guy named Leontius who's got an appetitive desire for the corpses, right? So it's very likely that what we're talking about is a person who's walking along outside and he sees some naked dead people and he considers stopping to look at them in a lascivious way, right? He had an appetitive desire to look at them, But at the same time, he was disgusted and turned himself away. All right, so he had an appetitive desire to look at them, a sexual desire to look at them, but there's some other desire that's making him turn away. For a while he struggled and put his hand over his eyes, but finally, mastered by his appetite, he opened his eyes wide and rushed towards the corpses, saying, "Look for yourselves, you evil wretches, take your fill of the beautiful sight." Socrates adds, and this is important, Socrates adds, "Yet surely the story suggests that anger sometimes makes war against the appetites as one thing against another." So what's going on here? On one hand, Leontius has a appetitive sexual desire to look at the corpses, but on the other hand, he has an aversion to looking at them. He refuses to. Don't! Why? Well, Socrates remarks that he is angry at his appetites. Angry at them. Based on what we said about anger, what would that mean? It's as though he's insulting himself. He's making himself look bad by stopping to gaze at the bodies. So it's like this. He could stop and look at the bodies and indulge in a sexual appetite, but that would make him look bad. That would be an insult to him. It would be shameful. Shame is anger directed at oneself. That's shame. The thing that's forbidding him from indulging in appetites is his sense of shame, is his sense of social esteem, his aversion to being insulted, right? The spirited part of the soul. So Leontius has an appetitive desire to look at the corpses, but a spirited aversion to looking at the corpses. So this tells us spirit, the desire for social esteem, the desire to be honored, the part of us that we feel anger with, that's not the same thing as our animalistic appetites. Because we can find cases in which they conflict, right? We can find cases in which, our animal appetites go one way, but our sense of what's honorable and shameful says no, right? And very frequently, our sense of what's proper and our sense of what is appropriate and what will make us seem nice and good to other people, our sense of what's honorable, that frequently suppresses our appetites. Consider, you're sitting at the dinner table and you're really, really hungry. Appetite says, grab that food and eat it. But you are a guest in a household and they are a religious family and they're still saying grace, right? So do you still want to grab the food? Well, your appetite hasn't gone away, your hunger is still there, but you have an opposing desire or an opposing part of your soul. Your desire for social esteem says, no, wait until they're done saying grace. Your desire to be honored, right? Your desire to be liked and to be appropriate, that your spirited part of the soul says, no, don't eat. Appetite says eat, spirited part of the soul says, don't eat. Or maybe you're walking through the bookstore and you see a tempting, titillating, exciting-looking, lurid book, and you consider stopping to look at it, but then you realize you're in public and some people might see you, and you don't want to be seen that way, right? There's the appetitive desire that says, look at that book. And then there's your desire to be socially esteemable and to avoid embarrassment. And that part of you says, are you crazy? Don't look at the book. In fact, that very case is very much like the case of Leontius. So anyway, to the question of whether the part with which we feel anger is the same as our animalistic appetitive part of the soul, the answer is no. They're different. But what about the idea that the spirited part of the soul and the rational part of the soul are the same? What about that idea? Could it be that our desire for the overall calculated good is just the same thing as our desire for social esteem? How would we rule that out? One reason why Socrates rules out the identity of the spirit and the rational parts is that he claims babies have a spirited part of the soul. They're angry all the time. They feel insulted by the fact that you're not giving them this and not giving them that and allowing them to endure the pain of this and the pain of that, right? Babies are full of a spirited desire for attention, but they don't have a developed desire for the overall calculated good yet, right? So Socrates says babies, they lack a rational part of the soul, but they have a spirited part of the soul, so that's one way that you could tell that they're different. But more importantly, Plato appeals to a case in the Odyssey. He specifically quotes the Odyssey's 20th book, when Odysseus struck his chest and spoke to his heart, spoke to his thumos, his spirit, his warrior spirit. What's going on in that passage? Well, to remind you, here's what's going on. Odysseus has just arrived home. He's been delayed by the sea god Poseidon from coming home by a decade, an extra decade. So it's been 20 years coming home from Troy. And along the way, he's had to fight monsters. He's had his friends and his shipmates destroyed and eaten in front of him. He's lost his ships. He's had to regain his ships. He's become addicted to things and then gotten over the addiction. He's endured all this, and he finally gets home. And what does he see? He sees a bunch of guys. A bunch of guys trying to seduce his wife, right? They're, I assume, putting on his bathrobe, and they're putting their feet up on the good upholstery, and they're going through his record and comic collections and putting their hands all over it, and they're slapping each other on the back, and they're being like, Odysseus, remember when we worried about that guy? Ha! How do you think Odysseus felt? Remember, he's a warrior. He's an Archon, mighty warrior king. That's right, he was insulted. Odysseus was furious. He was ready to just start stabbing, and he was going to throw down right there. But he struck at his chest, and he spoke to his heart, and he says, "Bear up, my heart. You've endured worse than this." And he's thinking this. He's thinking, whoa, you could get angry right now, and you could just attack. But you know you're tired from your journey coming home. Those guys outnumber you, right? They're more prepared for battle than you. You're going to get swarmed, and you're going to lose the battle, or you're going to die, right? So do not give in to anger. Wait. Plan. Don't just start killing. Wait. Then start killing, right? That's the idea. That on one hand, Odysseus had a spirited desire for revenge, right? A spirited desire to right the wrong of his not getting enough social esteem by making sure they give it to him by defeating them, right? But then he also has a desire for the overall good, which says, don't do that. He's got an aversion to revenge, an aversion to giving in to his spirited desire, which is based on his desire for the overall calculated good, right? So we find that there are times in which the spirited part of the soul, the part that wants to be honored, the part that wants social esteem, right, can conflict with our desire for what we know to be the overall good, right? That those can conflict, and because they can conflict, they're not the same thing. Our desire for popularity is not the same thing as our long-term interest in the good. That's what this is. Cases like that are supposed to show. Consider a very similar case. Suppose that through a series of unfortunate events, you find yourself standing before a judge, and he is pronouncing a sentence. And in the course of addressing you, the judge insults you. He talks down to you. He says a word that's actually kind of offensive to you. And he acts like it's no big deal, right? Now, part of you, right, wants to tell him off. Part of you says, oh, I'm gonna, you think that about me, Judge? Well, But hopefully there's another part of you that says, wait a minute, if you do that, you're going to make things worse for yourself. Don't do that yet. Yes, he insulted you. Yes, that sucks. But, and yes, you're angry, but think of the long-term good, right? Any case in which one holds back their anger because they're thinking about the long term, that's a case in which the rational part of the soul is conflicting with the spirited part of the soul, right? Another case we might imagine is where a comedian might struggle over the decision of whether to make fun of a close friend. If they do make fun of the close friend, they're going to get lots and lots of popularity, and everyone's going to think they're funny, and they're going to be very well loved and very honored. So the spirited part of their soul is saying, come on, make fun of them, you're going to get a lot of laughs. But there might be some part of them that's interested in the overall calculated good. That says, well, overall, even if you get more popularity, and even if you never lose that popularity, it's a bad thing to do to your friends. That's not an animalistic urge saying that. It's your desire for the overall calculated good saying that. Right? So again, it looks like there are cases that show that reason and spirit conflict, and so they're not the very same element. And there are cases where spirit and appetite conflict and show that they're not the same element. And we already used the surgery example to show that reason and appetite conflict. So we've got a set of arguments for why there are three parts to the soul, the tripartite division of the soul. So we've got this psychology, or a nascent psychology, that says that our lives are kept in a kind of struggle or balance by the urgings of these different parts of us. There's a part of us that is appetitive, right, that seeks food and intoxication and sex and the basic money with which to get those things. It just wants those animal things. There's a part of us that wants popularity and wants to be liked and wants to be celebrated. And then there's a part of us that wants whatever is good overall. Those are the appetitive, spirited, and rational parts of the soul, respectively. I want to say something about the rational part of the soul right here, is that it's the desire for the overall calculated good, whatever that may be, right? It's not guaranteed to have a correct conception or a correct calculation of that, right? So consider somebody who unfortunately became an addict and they're going through rehab, right? Maybe their sense of what's cool is against this. Maybe they think it's nerdy for them to be in rehab. They think, oh man, this is so nerdy, it's dorky, rehab is for losers. And so the spirited part of their soul, the part that is tuned into what social esteem is and what's cool and popular, that part is against rehab, right? But their desire for what's good overall, their desire to actually improve their life overall, the rational part of the soul, that one says stay in rehab, you should, right? That seems to be a pretty straightforward case, right? And of course we could add that the appetitive element is also siding with the spirited element here. So this would be a very, right, because the appetitive element wants the drug itself, and then the spirited element thinks it's cool to do the drug, and the only thing that's keeping the person in rehab, let's say, is their rational desire to pursue what's good overall. In those circumstances, you would have to hope that the rational desire is stronger than the other two combined. In our next lecture, we're going to talk about this notion of strength and overcoming and interpsychic conflict in more detail. But for now, I want to note that things would be much different if this hypothetical person were raised with an alternative conception of what the overall good is, right? Suppose they were raised in some weird environment where they were taught that what is overall healthy is to be an addict, where they're taught that that's what's good, right? If they were actually taught that, then they would think rehab is a bad thing, and it's not a bad thing because it's uncool, and it's not a bad thing because you've got the urge for the drug. It's a bad thing overall, right? Their desire for the overall calculated good leads them to avoid rehab, right? Right? So, having a desire for the overall calculated good does not mean that your conception of the good is correct. That's a separate thing, right? But we're going to talk more about that and other complications in our next lecture. For now, let's just note that for Plato, the soul is divided into three parts. Those parts are three different drives, and we can tell that they are three and not one or two because of their unresolvable conflicts with one another. Conflicts which, on pain of contradiction, require there to be multiple parts, right? So we've got the spirited part, the appetitive part, and the rational part. As a fun exercise, you might try to come up with a version of the argument, which I listed before, the argument which distinguished appetite from reason. Come up with a version of the argument which similarly distinguishes appetite from spirit, and another version which similarly distinguishes reason from spirit. Can you do that? Might be fun to try. Anyway, we'll continue talking about Platonic psychology next time. Thanks very much for watching. Bye!